Would you like to know what the Chinese President Xi Jinping is up to and whether China presents a threat to the United States? Well, today I have a very special guest for you who is a preeminent China expert in America, probably the best one and the most credible one out there. Introducing Gordon Chang. He's the author of The Coming Collapse of China, and he knows the motivations and the goals of President Xi Jinping better than anyone else. Welcome, Gordon Chang.
Thank you, Rebekah.
Thank you so much. I know you're super busy right now with all the interviews. The Chinese are having the Olympics, and we are very honored and delighted to have you on Censored but Not Silenced. I'm your host, Rebekah Koffler, a former DIA intelligence officer and author of Putin's Playbook, Russia's Secret Plan to Defeat America. The first question, Gordon, that I would like to ask you, given the Chinese are having their Olympics right now, a huge event. Other than the regular goals, did Xi Jinping have anything else in mind to achieve with this big event? And if he did, how's he doing right now? Is he pleased with what's going on? You know, give us a sense of what he's thinking potentially.
This is a critical year for Xi Jinping because if the schedule holds, the Communist Party will hold its 20th National Congress sometime October, November. And Xi wants a precedent-breaking third term as General Secretary of the Communist Party, which means that everything that happens this year is directed towards getting that third term. And of course, he is very closely identified with the Winter Olympics that are now ongoing because he was managing them. He inspected all the preparations and the construction. And so he is very much got an interest in making sure that these games go well for Beijing, but they're not. It's a public relations disaster for China, at least outside of China. And he's got to weather that.
Okay, what do you think? Why do you think is a disaster? In what sense? Give us a little more detail, if you would, please.
A couple things. First of all, because China's hosting these games, it gives a platform to its critics. So, for instance, those people who talk about genocide, crimes against humanity, against the Uyghurs, the Kazakhs, and others, they now have a much bigger platform to talk to the world. And of course, people make the comparisons to the 1936 Summer Olympics in Berlin, although this is worse in many respects because China's crimes right now, they're probably certainly comparable and undoubtedly worse than what the Third Reich was doing in 1936.
Wow.
The other thing is that the world didn't know as what was going on in the Third Reich. They didn't have social media. They didn't have the global media platforms. We do know these things right now, which means that hosting these games is a shame on us. But the other thing is that Beijing's treatment of the athletes has been inhumane. Beijing insisted on stricter COVID protocols than the International Olympic Committee wanted. So really what has happened is that China has used these stricter protocols to essentially take off the field of competition foreign athletes. You've heard of so many foreign athletes who are now in quarantine, but you don't hear of Chinese athletes in quarantine.
Really?
And in these quarantine facilities, they're so small that athletes can't actually exercise. They're getting inadequate quantities of food, and the quality of food is really substandard. So we've had all of these complaints, and the IOC actually had to step in. So that has not helped.
Interesting. Do you think it's all deliberate? Do you think it's all part of the plan to give advantage to Chinese athletes?
Oh, of course. There's no question about it. There's no other explanation that is consistent with the facts. And I think that after these games are over, and when we see the numbers of foreign athletes who have been put into essentially a cage, and the Chinese athletes who have not been affected by the COVID protocols, people are going to start to raise questions about all of this. Plus, also, China is using the games for political purposes, and that has not played very well. And just to give you one example, one of the interim torchbearers is a colonel in the People's Liberation Army, Chief Abao. He was a leader of the sneak attack on the night of June 15th, 2020 in the Galwan Valley, which is below the line of actual control in Indian-controlled territory. And this didn't work out very well for China, because India had decided not to participate in the diplomatic boycott of the opening and closing ceremonies. But when they learned in New Delhi that she was going to be one of the torchbearers, they just pulled out their representation. So really what China has done through many different ways, and these are not all of them, but through many different ways, has shown a face that the world abhors. And so this has not been a good games for the Chinese, at least outside of China. They can spin it almost any way they want inside the country, but Xi Jinping, I think, is going to suffer some consequences for this as people around the world start to look at China in a very different light.
Interesting. You can't make this up. Thank you, Gordon, for these incredible insights. Speaking about the spin, or as the Russians call it, disinformation, right? Let's talk about COVID a little bit. We know that there were two theories regarding the origins of this atrocious virus that plunged the entire world in chaos and disarray and dysfunction, if you will. And one of the theories was ironically suppressed by none other than possibly our own intelligence community. So can you make an assessment, or do you have an assessment, or can you make an assessment? What would be more likely? Is it the something that occurred naturally, or is it something that leaked from a Chinese lab? And if it's the latter, was it possibly deliberate? Just give us any analysis that you can.
I think it's about 95% sure that this was an engineered virus that could have probably accidentally leaked from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Mm-hmm. First of all, there are unusual features of SARS-CoV-2, the pathogen that causes this disease. Unusual arrangements of amino acids, for instance, which don't appear in nature. Also, they have not, even after all this time, been able to document the transmission links from supposedly a bat to a human. And I think that although they might need a bit more time to do this, the fact that they haven't even gotten close is a real indication that it was not natural. Plus, also, the Chinese regime did things which are not consistent with a natural pathogen. So, for instance, they sent their top biological weapons expert, Major General Chen Wei, to head the P4, the strictest biosafety unit at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And I think that her job was to clean the place up. But the fact that they sent her there is an indication that something occurred. Now, we have had numerous reports of researchers at the Wuhan Institute getting sick with SARS-CoV-2 before it got out into the general public. Researchers and the wife of a researcher died. So these are things which indicate a lab leak. But Rebekah, 95%, whatever. But the point is, there's something that we know 100%. 100% we know that China deliberately spread this disease beyond its borders once it got out into the general population in China. For weeks, Chinese leaders lied about the transmissibility of this disease. They knew that it was highly contagious human to human, and yet they told the world it was not. At the same time, they were locking down Wuhan and surrounding cities and other parts of China. They were pressuring other countries not to impose travel restrictions and quarantines on arrivals from China. Now, they did some other things, but just those two things alone indicate that this was deliberate. I mean, there's no other explanation that would fit the facts that this was negligent or whatever. They knew what they were doing. And that means that 5.8 million people outside China who died from this disease, they were murdered. And that includes, as of today, 924,000 Americans. So that we know 100%. And so therefore, it's incumbent on the President of the United States to take measures to make sure this doesn't happen again, because we know that China is working on even more deadly pathogens. They talk about specific ethnic genetic attacks. In other words, pathogens that'll leave the Chinese immune and kill everybody else. And that means those are civilization killers. And if we don't deter China, then they will feel that they can spread the next disease. And so far, China has suffered no cost for deliberately spreading SARS-CoV-2.
This is just such alarming revelations, Gordon, and it's really, really concerning. Speaking about deterring China, right? As you know, I come from the intelligence community, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and I saw, how intelligence gets, intelligence estimates rather get created. And given that theory that you said 95% is likely that it originated from a lab, potentially unintentionally being leaked. What is concerning to me, Gordon, is that the intelligence community has become so politicized right now. And do you think we are in a good position right now with President Biden being at the helm of our, wonderful country? Are we in a position to develop such a strategy? Can we stand up to Xi Jinping and whatever else? You mentioned there are some other more scarier things that are potentially in the works, such as genetic weapons. Can you give us an assessment of that?
Yeah, President Biden has done some things which are good in terms of defending the US, but they have been inadequate, and they've been inadequate across the board. And while we're talking about disease, let's look at his response to COVID-19. The first day that he was in office, he rejoined the World Health Organization. Now, it was the WHO working with China that spread the false narrative that SARS-CoV-2 was not contagious. Senior doctors at the WHO knew from the very first reports of the outbreak that this was a highly contagious disease. Maria von Kerkhoff, who's an American doctor at WHO, she gave actually a press conference, I think it was April 2020 or sometime around then, which said, look, when I first heard about this, it struck me that this was a coronavirus type issue. It was highly contagious. And yet the WHO took China's narratives and propagated them to the world. There was a January 9th, 2020 statement, and then there was the infamous January 14th, 2020 tweet from Director General Tedros. So WHO was complicit in this. And that means whatever you think of the global health architecture, President Trump was right to withdraw from the WHO because it was not possible to protect the United States from disease and still be a part of the WHO system. Now, as I mentioned, Biden in his first day in office rejoined. Biden has not been terribly curious about the origins of this disease. He didn't raise it during his February 2021 phone call with Xi Jinping, which was like 2 hours. He probably didn't raise it in his September phone call. And And it does not appear, despite what he said, but it does not appear that he talked about this during his video conference with Xi Jinping in December of last year. So this is a president who is not curious about something that has taken the lives of hundreds of thousands of Americans. And this just shows you the inadequate response of President Biden to China.
Do you think there are reasons for that lack of curiosity, as you termed? There's been a book, I think a book is written by Peter Schweizer, I believe, regarding some potential corruption between President Biden and his family and the Chinese. Is that something that has credibility or some truth to it?
This is a source of great concern, the financial relationships between China and Hunter Biden and between Hunter Biden and the rest of his family. And Peter Schweizer's book is an important first step. And this is something that federal authorities are, in fact, investigating, because there are a number of transactions that don't happen in the absence of corruption. They may be hard to prove, but nonetheless, when we're talking about the influences that Beijing has on Biden, whether or not they can prove a federal crime, it's a matter of great concern to the American people. There's a couple other things here. One of them is money always leaves a trail, Rebekah. So I think that eventually we'll get to the bottom of this. But there's something that doesn't leave a trail, which concerns me much more. And that is that Hunter Biden, by his own admission, is a troubled individual. He was on Chinese soil. If he ever did anything that was compromising there, and I'm sure that the Chinese agents tried to throw temptation his way. If he did something compromising on Chinese soil, then the Ministry of State Security will have proof of that. And that proof could be used in private conversations with the president himself to blackmail him. There are a couple of other things that I think that affect Biden's view of China, apart from these two. One of them is that Biden just generally believes in engagement of China, which is that failed doctrine, that the United States should help the Communist Party strengthen itself, because ultimately the party would see that it's in its interest to cooperate with the U.S. That's a failed theory. One of President Trump's major accomplishments was to ditch that idea as the basis for American policy. But Biden is going back to that, which I think is just wrong. And then, of course, Biden thinks that he needs China's cooperation to get an Iran nuclear deal, as well as climate change enhanced agreements. So he is going to sacrifice a lot of stuff in order to get China's cooperation. I think it's a fool's errand, and that's a very long conversation when we talk about either Iran or climate change. But the point is, that's the way President Biden thinks about these things, and so therefore that drives policy. So even if there were no corruption, even if Hunter Biden didn't do anything compromising on Chinese soil, Biden would still be making deeply misguided decisions about Beijing.
Very, very concerning. Thank you for these incredible insights. Let's go big picture a little bit. Do the Chinese have some, broader designs regarding their place in the world? Some analysts assess that China actually wants to take over the United States as a more dominant economic power. Some analysts believe that China is actually a threat number one from the military perspective to the United States. What is your analysis of Xi Jinping and China's long-term goal as it impacts the United States of America?
Xi Jinping has been pushing the view that China is the world's only sovereign state. I mean, we don't need analysts in the intelligence community. All we have to do is listen to what he says, what he writes, what his subordinates say and write. And he's pushing this notion of Chinese rulers having the mandate of heaven over Tianxia, or all under heaven. And they believe that they not only have the right to rule Tianxia, they also believe that heaven compels them to do so. Now, there's been a lot of people throughout history who have felt that they should rule the world. What differentiates Xi Jinping is that Chinese officials talk about ruling the moon and Mars, that they are, in fact, sovereign Chinese territory. So they've gone beyond planet Earth and now talking about the near parts of the solar system. So there's never been more ambitious rulers in history. And so, you have a lot of people, a lot of very smart people in Washington and elsewhere who will try to minimize China's ambitions. But we really need to look at what these guys say, because they actually tell us what they want. And we have people in our intelligence community, in our elites, who want to be deluded, who do not want to hear what the Chinese, in fact, are saying.
It's inconvenient, isn't it, to know the truth? I'm thinking, we have so much at stake with regard to China, right? Our iPhones that we all, hold are manufactured in China, right? So how difficult do you think it would be to wear? It's almost like being on the using a term that the Russians use frequently, being on the needle. How hard, and is it even possible to potentially wean the United States of the Chinese, needle, whether it's technology like chips production, any kind of any kind of parts of anything that we need, trinkets, right? Every time I go to McDonald's and I have kids, the kids ask me for those, like whether it's Happy Meal or whatever, and I deliberately, I can't stand it. I can't stand the little, trinkets that Americans keep buying from the Chinese. There's no reason for it. But even more than trinkets, we're highly dependent on some other very, very important parts. Is that even feasible for us to get off of that dependency, do you think?
We had a time, the answer is yes, we can get off the dependency. And there was a time when we didn't have trade, we didn't have technical cooperation agreements, we didn't have anything with the People's Republic. It was political decisions that allowed this situation to develop. So it's political decisions that could end it. Now, it takes a lot more political will than we see right now. But I think there are a couple of things. First of all, the Chinese always push too far. They will push the United States too far. At one point, it'll become politically unacceptable to trade with China, to have investments with China, to have technical cooperation agreements with China. But also there are a couple of other things, and that China's economy is in a very fragile state. There's a debt crisis. The economy is stagnating. And so China is just not going to be the shiny object that it is right now, and it'll become less important. Plus, also remember, they've got a demography crisis. China is projected to go into the steepest demographic decline in history in the absence of war or disease. China, which is about 1.4 billion people now, will probably lose half its population in 45 years. And that's not me talking. Those are two Chinese demographers who published a study last year. And all you have to do is a little bit of arithmetic. You take what is the probable total fertility rate, you multiply it out, and it shows that China's demography is going to be in a state of collapse, which means by the turn of this century, China and the United States will be probably about the same number of people. China may have a few more, but the point is it will go through a very difficult to manage decline. So ultimately, yes, but I think it will happen a lot earlier before that. The problem for China's leaders is that they've got simultaneous crises. They've got the debt crisis, they've got a stagnating economy, they've got worsening food shortages, a deteriorating environment, and COVID-19, which they can't control. Now, you put that and some other things together, and it shows, I think, that they will not be able to manage even those problems that they face.
Did you reflect all of these issues in your book? The collapse. Oh, remind the listeners, please, the title of your book.
The coming collapse of China. And I talked about everything but demography, because I was talking more about China at the turn of this century. But it is, as we start to look at that, the problems in China have really gotten to the point where I don't think the leaders are able to come up with solutions, not at least solutions within the context of their political system. Remember, Xi Jinping, if he gets his third term, he's going to continue a march back to totalitarianism, which China is certainly moving very fast toward. And he's moving back toward a state-dominated economy where there's really very little place for either foreign companies or domestic private entrepreneurs. So he's pushing foreign companies out of China, which means he's pushing out the things that China needs. So China, throughout its history, first years of the People's Republic and periodically throughout its imperial past, went through these times where Chinese rulers forced out foreigners, closed things up, closed China off from the rest of the world. And they always resulted in disasters for the Chinese state and for the Chinese people. And we're seeing Xi Jinping doing the same thing right now.
Got it. So we have just a couple of minutes left. Comment, please, on the Russia-China supposed alliance, the strategic alliance, as Xi Jinping and Putin are trying to present themselves as. And during the Olympics, as you know, Putin has assembled a giant military buildup along the border of Ukraine. He's trying to make some moves. We know that Xi Jinping and China have long-term designs on Taiwan. Can you shed some light on that relationship between Putin and Xi? And what lessons is Xi potentially learning from US responses to Putin's generated crisis in Ukraine?
All in 30 seconds, right?
No. You. I'm sorry. I know.
This is like the most important issue to the United States right now is the bilateral relationship between Moscow and Beijing. Extremely complicated, as you know better than anybody else. Of course, there are a lot of very, very smart people in Washington and elsewhere who will tell you, and it's absolutely true, that China and Russia have conflicting interests. And those interests over the long term will mean that they will not form a durable partnership. And I say, yeah, I can see that. But the point is, we don't care about China and Russia 50 years from now. We care about China and Russia right now. And right now, they are forming a very dangerous relationship. Now, on February 4th, Putin met Xi Jinping on the eve of the opening ceremony. They spent more than 2.5 hours, and they came up with a communique, which was really interesting. I think it was, in some respects, they talked about their no limits partnership, that their relationship was better than a Cold War alliance, that there were no areas of cooperation that were forbidden. This sounds like the Russian drafting of the communique, because I don't think the Chinese would normally want to say those things, but China signed on to it. And the thing that was important was that they announced $117.5 billion of oil and gas deals. And as Reuters reported, Russia plans to use an oil field or a gas field in Siberia that is under US sanctions in order to honor its commitments under those oil and gas deals that were just announced. Now, under those terms of those deals, oil and gas won't start flowing for 2 years at least. So it doesn't have real relevance to the Ukraine situation in a sense. But Russia is already selling hydrocarbons to China. And China can support the Russian economy now by increasing its purchases. The important point here is that, as Ned Price, our State Department spokesman, said on February 3, we cannot allow Chinese companies to backfill sanctions on Russia. In other words, to support the Russian economy as the US is sanctioning it. And so what I thought, when you look at the February 4th statements and what they announced, you got to be concerned that in the here and now, China and Russia are taking on the world. And they're certainly Beijing's making it much more difficult for the US to deal with Russia. So that's our concern at this particular moment. As I said, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now, who knows? But we have to be concerned what the Chinese and Russians are doing. And they are coordinating their foreign policies. They are coordinating their militaries. We got to be concerned.
Very scary times. Super insightful analysis by Gordon Chang. We are now out of time, but we would love for our listeners to know how they can find you, Gordon, where they can read your opinion pieces, your analysis. Give us your Twitter handles and any other information that you can give to the listeners of Censored But Not Silenced.
Yeah, my Twitter handle is at Gordon G. Chang, GordonGchang. And I archive my articles for free on my website, which is www.gordonchang.com.
Thank you so much again. It's been such an honor and pleasure to have you. This is Censored But Not Silenced with Rebekah Koffler. We provide insights and context to the most complex issues that are gripping America and the world today. Thank you all. If you like this, please like, subscribe, and get ready to listen to our next episode. Thank you, Gordon. Take care.